All right, so thank you again for joining us today. My name is Amanda Bayley, the CEO and co-founder of Planet Wild. I started Planet Wild here in Croton-on-Hudson, where I live 3 years ago, with a mission to restore habitat and biodiversity in the yard. I was born and raised in Westchester County, first lived in Peekskill, then Pleasantville, have had the fortune to grow up in what I think is one of the most beautiful places in the world. Before 2018, I'd been working for a landscape architect in Westchester, and before that, working in New York City Parks Department, designing green infrastructure, working for an environmental engineering firm, always focused on ecology and natural areas design, but also freelancing as a landscape designer in the suburbs, and was just so unimpressed with the amount of lawn and non-native shrubs, and thought, how does this make any sense? We need to plant for nature, especially when our world is facing a climate crisis and so many species are going extinct. I figured we could transform the lawn space to be so much more valuable than mowed turf grass. I read this article recently about Nevada actually banning ornamental lawns, which is huge, but I love this really kind of sad quote that the author used to describe lawns as these human monuments against biodiversity. So rather than work for another landscape architect designing more lawns and pools, or for a nonprofit or nature preserve working within public spaces, I thought there's a real need for ecology-driven landscaping work in the private yard. We can turn our yards into little oases of nature that store carbon, that feed pollinators, and that are rich with life and diversity. There is so much opportunity to transform the yard, especially here in Westchester County, abundant with natural beauty and where people want to make a change. So here we are now at Planet Wild 2021. We just rolled out our sustainable membership maintenance plans, which include 0 emission mowing and 15% off any rewilding plantings. We have an ambitious goal to plant 15,000 native plants, prevent 130,000 pounds of carbon emissions, and rewild 1,000 acres across Westchester County this year. And the Planet Wild team, we've just been killing it this season. We're making it an easy choice for our clients to invest in their yards and increase the value of their landscape. Speaking of value, what an amazing panel we have here today, discussing their research and their experience regarding Westchester County's canopy cover and sustainability. I hand it over to Bram Gunther, Planet Wild's VP of Strategy and Development, who is going to be introducing the panelists. Thanks, Bram.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. Thank you, Amanda and my Planet Wild team. Thank you, panelists, so much for taking the time to do this. We appreciate it. And thank you, clients, community members, friends, and family, who's ever on the line. You might have heard of the term urban-rural gradient. Maybe not. It's a bit of an esoteric term. It's a science term that refers to understanding the connections in its formal meaning through ecosystems and ecology, but it can be of anything, metaphorically, cultural institution, family units, for example, across this gradient, across the city, the suburbs, the exurbs, places like the Hudson Valley. In other words, we are all interconnected. I am a living example of the urban-rural gradient, and so is Planet Wild. I was chief of forestry in New York City for many years and co-founder of the Natural Areas Conservancy, a nonprofit based in New York City, but I retired in fall 2019, moving out of 30 years of urban conservation. I live in suburbia now, on the edge of the ex-urban, the rural, and through Planet Wild, I'm practicing and forging suburban, ex-urban conservation along that urban-rural gradient. We are all interconnected. Amanda's vision was that conservation can and should take place on private land to reach goals like saving and protecting 30% of our forests in wetlands as part of a new initiative called 3030, which has been adopted by the Biden administration and is being contemplated by New York State to be adopted. And to achieve targets from the Paris Accord, we need to convert and use private land as carbon sinks and biodiversity complexes. every piece of land counts. So what does ecological-based sustainability, preserving, expanding biodiversity, and storing carbon look like in the suburban context? That is what we will explore this evening. I'm now going to introduce our first presenter. Peter McCartt is the Director of Energy Conservation and Sustainability for the County Executive. Peter has had an extensive and successful business career with a focus over the last 15 years on the environment, energy conservation, and sustainability. Peter has been instrumental in the creation of several successful organizations and programs across the county. He sits on the board and co-founded the Directors of Sustainable Westchester. He created and has chaired Eastchester's Environmental Committee since 2006. He created and is executive director of the Friends of Twin Lakes County Park. He helped formulate and chair the advisory board of Southern Westchester Energy Action Consortium and is president of the Twin Lakes Civic Association. In 2012, Peter was named the United Way's Volunteer of the Year for his work on the environment in Westchester, Putnam, and Rockland counties, and has been cited for many other awards throughout his distinguished career. Peter and his family live in Westchester with their children. Take it over, Peter.
Thank you very much. That was something else. I really appreciate it. And we have 5 minutes here, so I'm gonna flash through. Start with the solar program. There's several segments that we work on here. It's the transportation, there's energy, and there's building. So I have instituted a solar program here. We got a phase 1, our low-hanging fruit, and a phase 2, as you can see. I'm going to go through these pretty quickly so you can just read it along. And I really want to get into what I really want to talk about. So vehicle electrification, converting our fleets, adding more charging stations for our own fleets, as well as the public. Are you seeing these screens? Are they going through? Okay, very good. And then energy conservation. These are some of the programs that we're working on here right now currently. Food scrap recycling. I'm pretty happy to announce that tomorrow we're doing a ribbon cutting for our new Compost Ed Education Center that's at the Valhalla campus. And that is going to be it's a medium size facility, so municipalities or institutions can see a model of how they can set one up themselves. It's going to handle about 2 tons of food scraps per week, and pretty exciting about that. We also have started the transportation disposal program where we are collecting the food scraps from approximately 20 and growing municipalities around the county to take that out of the waste stream. And then I'm going to get to really the meat and potatoes of what I wanted to talk about today, which I think is most important, and that's Planting Westchester. Planting Westchester really came out of the Million Tree campaign out of New York City. And we kind of wanted to do that same sort of thing, talking about sequestering the carbon that we have in our environment. And but then we wanted to expand it. I really wanted to include community gardens, and then as we're going to talk about, planting in our own yards. So really, what this is, the goal of Planting Westchester is to encourage and empower everyone who lives or works in Westchester County to grow more plants. So that together we can grow vegetables and fruits to increase local food security. Plant native plants and trees to conserve and restore local biodiversity. And the people behind me are all going to be talking about all of this in a lot more detail. And to protect and plant trees to reduce pollution, flooding, erosion, and to offer shade and cooling, which Andy Reinmann is really going to get into, I believe. This site will provide a comprehensive toolkit to help you choose, plant, and maintain trees, shrubs, and flowers with an emphasis on native plants and trees. And it's not just about planting, it will also have resources to help you learn about your soil, to protect existing trees and other native plants from invasive species. And how did we come up with these resources? mostly we had 100 dedicated and knowledgeable volunteers. Andy was one of them. Midge, I believe you were one, and Amanda, you were probably in there on it as well. And the members were on these 8 topics. So you'll see here the topic subjects, and they came up with. They edited and came up with best how-to articles, books, videos, and whatnot. Phase 1 is going to be the launch of the website, and then phase 2 will be adding some GIS maps that will include locations of different opportunities and community gardens and all sorts of different information and things. I don't know if people know, but Westchester County is 500 square miles. 14% of it is lakes and streams, and encompasses urban and rural settings. And it's beautiful, as Amanda said. We all love it, and we want to take care of it. Over a third of the land is categorized as open space. So that's Planting Westchester. It's going to be launched at the end of April. Millie McGraw, who is who's on the planning department here in Westchester County. She is working with Nikki Coddington, and like I said, 100 different volunteers in these topic areas. And we're very excited about it and looking forward to launching it. And I'm also, did I hit my 5 minutes? And I'm looking forward to hearing from everybody else here. So thank you guys. I'm here, I'm always here. And I'll put my email and my phone number in the chat feature. So thank you guys.
Thank you so much, Peter. And now we're going to move to Andy Reinmann. Andy Reinmann is at the CUNY Advanced Science Research Center and is an ecologist and biogeochemist who focuses on plant ecophysiology, don't ask me, and the terrestrial carbon cycle. He is particularly interested in understanding the effects of environmental change, for example, climate change, urbanization, land cover change, on terrestrial carbon cycling and nitrogen dynamics across a continuum of human disturbed land ecosystems, like the one we live in. Even though it's quite beautiful, it is disturbed. His research draws from multiple disciplines and combines field observations, ecosystem experiments, and laboratory analyses with GIS, remote sensing, and other sophisticated technology that exists today. And Andy and his family also live in Westchester, and he has projects in both forested and human-dominated landscapes throughout the mid-Atlantic and northeastern US. I turn it over to Andy.
Great. Thanks. Okay, can you guys all see my slide okay?
Yes.
Great. So I'm gonna, in 5 minutes, talk a little bit about, at a high level, the value of charismatic megaflora or trees, and then talk a little bit about some of the work that my group and others have been doing over the past couple of years, sort of tracking tree canopy cover and its ecosystem services across space and time in Westchester County. This work is being funded by the New York State DEC Hudson River Estuary Program. So there's a lot of reasons that we care about trees, and I'm sure many of these reasons you're familiar with. So of course, there's their important role in maintaining habitat for biodiversity and pollinators. They play really important roles in helping to maintain and improve air and water quality and regulate stream flow. And they also are, of course, important for aesthetics, dampening noise pollution, providing places to recreate. We hear a lot about their importance for carbon sequestration. And then what I'm going to talk a little bit about in the next couple of slides is the role that trees sort of in and around our communities can play in sort of thermal regulation or regulating the climate around us beyond just their capacity to sequester carbon. So first, just to introduce the project that we're working on in Westchester, some of you may have seen sort of our extended talks on this over the past year or two. We've given a series of webinars and seminars. There'll be a couple of more this summer and into the fall. And so what we're doing is we're using satellite imagery and a variety of other different data sets to quantify the kind of the spatial configuration of different land cover types across Westchester County. And that allows us to produce these really cool maps like I'm showing you here. This is showing a variety of different land cover types across Westchester. The different reds are different intensities of development. The greens are forested areas, and the yellows, which is our other common land cover type, is sort of broadly herbaceous cover. So these can be pastures, meadows, things along those lines. And of course, the blue is water. And so we can track how these different land covers are changing in time using this satellite imagery. And what we're finding as it relates to at least trees is that a little under half of all of Westchester is covered by forest. So it's about 550 square kilometers. But these things are changing over time and generally not in the direction that we'd like them to. So since 2001, we've lost nearly 30 square kilometers of forest area. This is almost entirely due to development. And those development patterns are working their way north in Westchester. And right now, it's really the northern part of Westchester that is receiving the greatest decline in forest cover. But in addition to the trees that we think about in our forests, there's lots of trees in our backyards, in our communities. And so collectively, the forested areas, as well as these other trees, collectively comprise what we would call just broadly our tree canopy cover. And so overall, Westchester County is covered by about 53% tree canopy. But this too is changing over time and not in the direction that we'd like. So we've lost about 20 square kilometers of canopy cover just since 2011. The other thing that's important here is that, of course, most of our canopy cover is from our forests, about 65%. But somewhere between 25% and a third of all of our canopy cover is the trees that we put in our backyards, that we plant along our streets, that we have in our parks. And so I think this really highlights the importance of thinking beyond just our forests in terms of tree canopy cover and the space we might have available to us to increase canopy cover. So why do we care about our forests? So I mentioned a lot of reasons earlier, and what I want to dive into a little bit deeper here is its role in regulating our climate, because I think this is something that maybe we know about, but maybe don't really have data to back this up. So what I'm showing you here on the left is the spatial distribution of tree canopy cover across Westchester, going from areas that are white, which have no canopy cover, through the light greens, which are low and moderate canopy cover, to the dark greens like Ward Pound Ridge Park, which has nearly complete canopy cover. And on the right is a map of land surface temperature. So this is the temperature that you would feel if you were to touch the Earth's surface. It's not the same as air temperature, but they're correlated. We get this from satellite imagery as well. And you can see, if you just look at it visually, there are these really tight correlations between where you have trees, like the northeastern part of the county, and where it's coolest, right? So the hottest areas of the county are also the areas that have the lowest amount of canopy cover. And so collectively, we can use this to make these arguments that increasing canopy cover can play a really important role in mitigating the local effects of urban heat island and climate change, and result in large reductions in energy consumption for cooling. We can put this together at sort of municipal levels, and we see this really strong correlation that as at the municipal scale, canopy cover increases, the temperature declines considerably. So the last thing I want to quickly go over is, okay, so what can we do to increase canopy cover? So of course, in our yards, those are the places we have most control over. We can plant trees, wherever we can. That's the argument that I would make. But I would also argue that we should make sure that what we're planting is appropriate for the location. Don't plant a giant oak tree in a place where there's power lines right near there, right? So that's a really important component. And the other thing that's important is at our community scale, the policies and programs that we implement are really important. So these are just really cursory preliminary analyses across Westchester County, where we, in a very coarse way, categorized each municipality as having a tree ordinance or not, some sort of tree planting program, and some sort of requirement for a tree removal permit, and looked at how that might have influenced changes in canopy cover over time. And what we find is the policy that seems to matter the most is having a tree planting program. So everywhere is losing canopy cover. The communities with some sort of tree planting program are losing it at a much slower rate than everywhere else. And then, of course, just to echo what Peter just talked about, please check out Planting Westchester. There's lots of great resources there to help you increase canopy cover. And then I just want to leave you with a picture of what we did with our yard last year, taking our little patch of lawn and turning it into a cut flower garden for our neighbors.
That's great. Thank you, Andy. That's fantastic. That data is so fascinating. I look forward to seeing it in more detail. So next up is Midge Iorio, who's the Executive Director of Bedford 2030. Since 2012, under Midge's leadership, Bedford 2030 has built a robust and trusted brand, engaged thousands of community members in Bedford and beyond, and expanded its programs, participants, and impact. In 2020, the organization announced a 44% reduction in community-wide greenhouse gas emissions, which is amazing. Congratulations. And last year launched Climate Action Now, with an aggressive new goal to reduce emissions by 80% within the township by 2030. Midge loves her role as a community ambassador. Some of her personal highlights include the 2020 Car Show, New York State's first fuel-efficient electric vehicle show, Meatless Mondays campaign, and the recent adoption of the Climate Action Now campaign. Prior to Bedford 2030, Midge worked for 13 years and as an advertising exec, and she too lives in Westchester with her family.
Thank you. So thank you for that introduction, and a huge thanks to Planet Wild for including Bedford 2030 on this excellent Earth Week panel. Bedford 2020, now Bedford 2030, is all about community climate action. We were formed in 2010 when a group of concerned local citizens decided they wanted to address the climate crisis right here at home. Our role was to mobilize an entire community in what at the time was an aggressive goal to reduce greenhouse gas emissions 20% by 2020. Over the past 10 years, we have initiated programs, campaigns, policy, partnerships in a wide array of action areas, from energy efficiency to food waste, to EVs, to climate-friendly yard practices, with the goal of facilitating community-wide greenhouse gas emissions and protecting our natural resources. In 2019, we did announce that we surpassed our greenhouse gas emission goal. And last year, with much work still to be done, we rebranded our movement, as Bram just said, as Bedford 2030 Climate Action Now. So now we are working towards this aggressive goal to reduce greenhouse gas emissions 80%, or close to 76,000 metric tons by 2030. And to date, we've been addressing our greenhouse gas reduction goals by increasing renewable energy, reducing fossil fuels, reducing energy use, and other effective means. However, we need to go beyond just emission reductions. To achieve our aggressive 2030 goals, we also must draw down greenhouse gases. So what are we doing here in Bedford? The Bedford Drawdown Initiative will engage the community in a nature-based solution to capture greenhouse gas emissions. In other words, we plan to leverage our land, our trees, and our plant life in our fight for the climate change. Our goals are: one, to measurably increase drawdown, to measurably increase greenhouse gas drawdown through natural resources, and to model how a community can draw down greenhouse gases naturally. We're approaching this project the way we approach everything, through a continuous gear of community education, activism, and feedback. Our initial priority for this project is mapping the town's natural resources. We are currently creating a land asset inventory of how many acres of forest, wetlands, lawns and gardens, developed land, and other classes we have here in Bedford, using a layering of GIS maps. And for example, we figured out that 66% of our land is forest. So I just learned that we're above average for Westchester, but also that northern Westchester is at great risk for tree loss. 10% of our land is developed hardscape, 9% is developed groundscape or lawns and garden. We're also doing research to help determine how to use our land inventory to figure out how much carbon is stored in Bedford now through our natural resources, and to determine our highest opportunities to increase carbon capture. We will use our learning and data to do what we do, drive high impact community action. And we're currently developing some pilot projects with the goal of engaging the entire community in healthy yard and land practices as citizen scientists, and to become part of this nature-based solution. And project areas that we're looking at include a carbon farming pilot to increase carbon capture in lawns and yards, and to help, have community members test their soil and convert lawn to plants. We do have a tree planting project for this summer planned, and that's something we will continue to do. And we're even considering perhaps a town goat herd to regenerate local grasslands and manage invasives. And for this project and every project, really in all of our work, collaboration is essential to achieving our goals. For this project, we're partnering with citizens, with government, organizations, businesses, education institutions towards a shared desire to preserve and enhance natural resources and use nature-based solutions to fight climate change. And at the end of the day, our goal is for everyone to come together to take climate action now, because we can. And I'll just, a quick shout out. We are hosting in partnership with Healthy Yards, another incredible Westchester organization in this space, working to get our land filled with pollinators and native plants. We are hosting the Bedford 2030 Earth Day Festival on Saturday, May 2nd. I'm going to put our website and my email address in the chat, and hope you guys will all come. Thank you.
Okay, that was great, Midge. Thank you so much. And our last panelist is Peter Groffman, who is a professor at the CUNY Advanced Science Research Center, which is also where Andy is, just to remind you. And he's also a professor at Brooklyn College Department of Earth and Environmental Sciences, and a senior research fellow at the Carey Institute of Ecosystem Studies, which is just a bit north of us here in Westchester. He has research interests in ecosystems, soil, landscape, and microbial ecology, with a focus on carbon and nitrogen dynamics. Peter currently serves on the Scientific and Technical Advisory Committee of the National Ecological Observatory Network, NEON, and was chair of the Science Council of the U.S. National Science Foundation funded Long-Term Ecological Research Network from 2015 to 2019. He is a participant in the long-term research projects in Baltimore, which is obviously an urban center, and New Hampshire, northern hardwood forests. And I should say, from my personal perspective, a lot of the policies and decision-making in New York City about long-term conservation and sustainability came from research that was coming from this long-term study, groundbreaking study in Baltimore. Peter was a convening lead author for the 2013 U.S. National Climate Assessment Chapter on Ecosystems, Biodiversity, and Ecosystem Services, and a lead author for the second Wetlands and third North America assessment reports of the Intergovernmental Program on Climate Change. Take it over, Peter.
Okay, so I study suburban lawns. I study suburban ecosystems, and I'm just thrilled to be able to talk to people who think deeply about these and who manage these. And so I just love to get an opportunity to talk to a group of people who are managing their lawns and their opinions about it. And so I wanted to share a little bit of our research on this, talk about some of the things that we've learned, but then also talk about some of the new things that we're thinking about, some of the things maybe that we're a little bit concerned about. So in the current research, we have been comparing different types of yards, and we classify people's yards into 4 different types. There are high intensity yards, which are characterized by fertilizer use and pesticide use. We contrast those with low intensity yards, which are yards where people just mow. And it's actually the largest group as we look across the country. About 50% of the yards in the U.S. are these low intensity yards where people don't fertilize, they don't use pesticides, they just kind of mow. And we've been contrasting these kind of very common types of yards with yards certified by the National Wildlife Federation. And we've been contrasting those with yards with a hydrologic feature, which in this case is a rain garden, is very common. And so we have this question, and people like Amanda and Bram wonder about this kind of thing all the time. It's like, so if I change the management of my yard, am I going to get some big benefits and things I'm interested in? So, and we see clear effects of these different types of management on birds, on bees, and on soil insects, and then on a bunch of ecosystem processes, things like carbon and nitrogen storage and water use efficiency and nutrient retention and the types of plants that we hope to support. And so the basic message of our research is that yes, it really matters what you do in your yard, and especially people who are thinking creatively about what we can do in our yards, you can get some really stunning effects. And I have some really detailed scientific papers to illustrate this. And if people are having trouble sleeping at night, I can provide you with copies of these papers. And the other thing I would note is that we've been doing this all over the country. So in our study, we have been comparing these yard types in 6 cities across the US, in Boston, Baltimore, Miami, Minneapolis, St. Paul, Phoenix, and Los Angeles. And these effects are quite robust across these cities, which, you know, it's a big range of climates from warm to wet to cold to hot. One of the things that we noticed though, is that a lot of our neighborhoods look the same, right? So here's a Google image of 2 neighborhoods, and one of them is in Boston and one of them is in Phoenix. And you know, if you look closely, you can kind of tell, you see, well, there's all these swimming pools over there, there must be Phoenix. No, actually that's Boston. This is Phoenix over here, which actually has more pools and smaller trees. But one of the things we began to worry about or become interested in is this idea of ecological homogenization. Are we spreading out across the country and creating this vast ecosystem type? We call it the American residential macro system. And what might the ecological and social implications of that be? And to think about this homogenization, it's really easy to tell where you are if you back out a little bit, right? So this is Phoenix, a neighborhood in Phoenix next to the Sonoran Desert. And here's a neighborhood in Boston next to the northeastern forest that we have over here. And what we've been wondering about is, are we homogenizing the country, right? So these natural ecosystems are really different. And we've replaced these natural ecosystems with our residential ecosystems. And are we losing some type of ecological diversity at that whole scale? And it creates a new challenge. So it's creating a new challenge for people like Bram and Amanda and other people who think creatively about their yards. Is we've learned we can get a lot done if we manage these yards to improve the ecological function and the biodiversity in them. But the real challenge is, if we really want to preserve some aspects of native biodiversity in these areas, we might have to work a little bit harder. And we're worried about this thing we call the homogenization cascade, which we think is driven by, we change our soils, and we change our soils, and they're able to support the managed plant communities that we plant, but they may not be all that capable of supporting the native biodiversity that plays a role and is becoming increasingly rare in places like Westchester. So we see this homogenization cascade where we have altered soils, we have altered plants, we have altered wildlife, and then a variety of altered services. Again, you know, the good news is that we can manage these communities to achieve real ecological outcomes. But I think the challenge going forward for a group like this is to think about, can we somehow within our matrix of our residential landscapes maintain some of the true native biodiversity that we want? And so there's good news and there's some challenges ahead, and it's really fun to talk to a group like this about these kinds of results.
So that was great. All of you, the story that each one of you had to tell. I think there's good news in each story, and there's, as Peter said, there's challenges too. I'm going to have some questions for you guys. I'm going to start with a personal question for each one of you. And then a few, we're only probably going to do 10 minutes, I think, 10 to 15 minutes of questions amongst us, so we can give some time for the audience to ask their questions. But let's start with what drew you to environmental work? What started it for you? And let's start with you, Midge.
Okay, well, my whole life I've been a hiker, and I draw botanicals, and that's really what got me interested in the natural world. I joined Bedford 2030 10 years ago, leaving the marketing and advertising world, and what I thought was a transitional job, and it's changed my life. I've become a climate warrior, passionate climate activist, and that's my answer.
Okay, thank you. Peter McCartt.
Sure. Start out with me. My grandfather was the chief civil engineer for the Commonwealth of Kentucky. And he was just a naturalist from day one. He didn't hunt, but he did a lot of fishing and was in nature all the time. And I used to go out with him when he was doing an engineer surveying some property like that. And he really instilled it in my whole family. My brother is got his master's degree in fisheries and wildlife management. My cousin is he's a chief ornithologist for the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, and it's in our system. But to get to climate change, then I lived in Manhattan for 31 years, and it's fairly environmental in a kind of way, with mass transit and sharing of services and whatnot. But then I moved up to Westchester, and it changed it all. And the big one is having kids. So suddenly there's a reason that I'm looking towards the future. And so for me, it was really, caring about our environment and, the future for the children.
Great. Peter Groffman.
Yeah, so I got it in my head that I wanted to be a scientist when I was in the 3rd grade. And I couldn't, figure out what kind of scientist I wanted to be, but I grew up in the suburbs of New Jersey, and I spent time wandering around in creeks and woodlots, similar to what we have in Westchester. And I was wondering, I guess when I was in high school or so, where do all the leaves go? So every year these woodlots, they fill up with leaves, and it's like, well, no one's raking them, and where are they going? And I became very interested in ecosystem processes related to the carbon cycle, kind of from just empirical observations. And then I went to college and I went to graduate school, but I always had this idea that I wanted to be a scientist, and I had this interest in the environment. And when we work with a lot of students and young people, and people have really tortured paths to careers, and I consider myself pretty lucky.
Well, you're living the dream, Peter. And then Andy, let's end with you.
All right, so I guess, I went to college thinking I was going to become a physical therapist. And the summer before I left, the physical therapists who I was working for, who initially inspired me to become a physical therapist, took me to the Adirondacks for my first time. And that was really like my first time hiking in any sort of wilderness. And that made me really confused then about what I thought my passions were. And so my first semester at Binghamton, I took an introductory environmental studies class. And I grew up in Rockland County in suburbia with a family that didn't spend a whole lot of time in the outdoors. And this class exposed me to, I guess, all of the different ways that kind of humans are messing with each other and messing with natural ecosystems. And it was like really eye-opening for me. And our class discussion sections took place in the campus nature preserve, where we would walk around, learn how to identify plants and stuff. And somewhere along the way, I realized that you could have a career where that's what you're doing, and you're studying how ecosystems are responding to what humans are doing. And so for me, like, I left physical therapy long behind me, and overnight just changed my career trajectory. And before I went to get my PhD, I worked for Hudsonia, a great nonprofit organization in Dutchess County. And we did a lot of work focused on land cover change and working with a lot of landowners. There was a lot of interest and concern about what can we do at a local level to deal with climate change. And I didn't have a whole lot of answers, but that sort of inspired or was the impetus for a lot of the things that I went on to study after that. And then after my PhD, I came back to the land cover change, climate change piece, and here I am.
Well, we're thankful for that. Thank you. That was great. I think it's 6:44, so I'm going to ask one amalgamated question that each one of you can bite into. And it's partly based upon what you were talking about, Andy, and that the northern part of Westchester is most vulnerable to forest loss because of development. And I think we all know why. There's more land here. The pandemic has shot people out of New York City. So what do we do? Number one, what do we do in terms of science and policy to make sure that development, which seems inevitable, does not then also take down our forests and habitats? In other words, how can they be compatible? How can we make them compatible through research that's very clear that there's more ecosystem sciences from native forests and leaving forests and habitats intact? And then from the policy end, what policies can we enact to force developers to take conservation seriously? So either, I'm not going to call, well, let's start with you, Midge, again, from the policy side and from the community side.
Well, I mean, from the policy side, I guess, you know, first and foremost, we saw a map of towns that have tree ordinances, for example, and having that is really important, and making sure those ordinances mean something, and making sure that there's adherence to them, what is a huge thing from a community basis. And, you know, from a science standpoint, from the community level, I think it's really taking what we do at Bedford 2030, which is to really meet people where they are, and to try to make the idea of, you know, the importance of trees, the importance or the idea of a new aesthetic, and to really, you know, bring them along. Citizen science is a great way to inspire and engage people and bring them into this. And, you know, our goal is to build an army of people and an army of trees.
So Peter McCartt, let's jump to you. So since you work for the county executive,
Yeah.
through policy, can we change the standard and historical model of development? Can we just mandate that you can't take anything down, or if you do, you have to replace it, but 7, 10, 20-fold as we do in New York City? Or as we did past 10?
That's a loaded question there, Bram. So, you know, for the county, we're in a unique situation. We don't have residents per se, you know, that's based into the municipalities. So I'm not copping out. We do have legislation. So we actually enacted but again, this is just for county property. We enacted a native plant only planting, you know, but we can only affect what we own, you know, what the county owns. I did want to say, I think and all 6 of the faces, including myself, that I see in front of me, we all do the same thing. It's all about education and advocacy. And we really, all 6 of us are pushing on that. I think everybody probably on this call to some degree or another, it's got to reach out beyond the choir. You know, we got to constantly get to other people. And I think we do a pretty good job here in Westchester. We're in pretty good shape. As bad as we're kind of making it sound to be, we're doing a good job, I think, all in all. You know, with work like with Sustainable Westchester, what Andy's doing, what Midge is doing there with Bedford 2030 and her group. What I would like to see more is reaching, and you're talking about the northern part, I would like to see us all reach into the southern portion of the county and really dig into those areas where the heavy majority of our demographics or the population lies. So it's we just got to keep doing what we're doing, keep pushing and changing. And elections do have consequences, as we've seen and we know. That's another thing.
That's great. Thank you. So Andy, Peter, I'm going to leave this for both of you. How can research reinforce or change development policy to be more conservation minded? And what research might be missing for that?
So one thing that we're interested in is characterizing the true cost of different development patterns. So I think we all know that our ecological impact would have been better if we would have all stayed in the city. If we were all living in 700 square foot apartments in the Bronx, our ecological, and Peter said that, our ecological impact is low. So if we're going to move out of the city, then I think we need to recognize what the true costs are of fragmentation, of roads, of maintaining the roads, and can we craft policies to steer people? So if people want to live and move out of the city, can they live in our villages? Can we densify our villages more than sprawling out across the landscape? But these are very complex issues and that are kind of beyond the scope of a humble ecologist. But I think we need to think about those and start to quantify what are the real costs of different development patterns. And at the same time, do what Peter says, and what Midge says is, there's a lot we can do in the densely settled parts of the county. We've done a lot with changing the landscaping to improve its ecological function. And in places where there's a lot of trees, it's not rocket science, but a tree ordinance really matters. And so I think there are a bunch of things that we can do with the development patterns that we have, but I think we need to think very thoughtfully about the real cost of different development patterns.
And I guess I'll add a couple of things to that. I think the zoning thing is important. Everyone moves to the suburbs, they want their 1 acre lot, and that I think very quickly can lead to a tragedy of the commons issue and a lot of forest fragmentation. Some of the analyses that we've done, we find that where forests are most vulnerable in Westchester is private land where the land is still subdividable based on current zoning laws. And that's the huge part of northern Westchester. The other things that we need to think about and from a research and learn more about is some of our work is showing that when you fragment forests, you change the way they grow, but you can also make them more sensitive to heat and climate change. And so we can't think of our forest just as like this snapshot in time, but the way we change the landscape is also going to have repercussions for how the forests respond to that. And the other thing that I think is useful to point out is, so we know our trees are really important in cooling off our communities, right? And there's a lot of areas in our community where we're not sort of saturated with trees. So there's still a lot of room to increase canopy cover. There's also a lot of environmental justice issues surrounding canopy cover. We find that in the more densely populated areas of the communities that have the highest income have the highest tree cover. And so I would view that as opportunities for places where we can target some of our tree planting efforts. The last piece that I'll add is from a carbon sequestration perspective. I would argue that in suburbs, in residential areas, probably the biggest benefit of trees is cooling, because that could greatly reduce electricity consumption and carbon emissions. But we do find that planting trees in our yards, having trees in residential areas, because those trees can grow faster, they're not surrounded by competing trees, they're feeding on irrigation and fertilizer we might throw in our yards, they can actually in relatively short time help to offset some of the lost carbon sequestration that occurred when that land was developed. So we want to keep the forest that we have, but there's also a lot of good that we can do with the land that has already been developed and the land that inevitably will become developed.
That's great. So let's start with a question that seems to be on a lot of people's minds, and that is, what do you do about deer? Speaking about pressure on forests and native habitats, there is development and there is deer. So what's everyone's take on deer and how to manage deer here in Westchester?
We need hunting.
Yeah.
It makes a huge difference. Like the county parks, Ward Pound Ridge, and then some of the private preserves like Teton, other places, there is hunting, there's deer exposures, and it's, on one hand, people don't like it because you're killing deer. On the other hand, without it, we don't have a forest moving forward, and we also don't have a healthy deer herd. And so I just think it's sort of an unfortunate reality that we need to come to.
Yep, couldn't agree more. They, the deer become malnutrition. I just was on a webinar earlier today on Duke Farms and their deer culling operation they have there, and it makes all the difference in the world. So sadly, they need to be managed.
Yes, I can say quickly, I tried to start a hunt in New York City. It failed. But there are hunts in Philadelphia and Washington, D.C. So it makes me optimistic that New York City might eventually get there, as well as Westchester across the county.
One of the things they were talking about was bow hunting, because there's a fear of when you take a shot that if you miss, it's going to go, because we're fairly dense, but they were using bow hunting that is a little bit safer, if you will.
Yeah, so here's a question. Are there resources to help homeowners develop valuable landscapes in terms of biodiversity? What are the most helpful plants? Where to find true native plants versus cultivars? And how to maintain spaces to support the creasers who rely on them? And Amanda, if you want to jump in for that question.
No, I want this one.
Peter, it's yours.
Call Amanda Bayley at Planet Wild.
I would second that. I think all the nuances of that question we will not get to today, but maybe we can get to post the show.
I was just going to give a shout out to Healthy Yards. I think that Fiona and Philippine, I saw them on here. That is such a good resource. I'm going to put that in the chat. I'll put the information in the chat for all of our attendees.
And Planting Westchester, which will be out soon. Give it a couple more weeks, and I think that's going to be an extremely valuable resource as well. Urban planting all the way to invasive management. Deer and whatnot. The vines have killed me. The vines that we have are just, up and down. You see the parkways are the trees are just being dragged down. It's so sad.
Well, that we need some capital money for. But Midge, let's end with you. There's a question specifically for you regarding the 80% reduction goal. Are you focusing only on scope 1 and scope 2 emissions? And that's from the Paris Accord. How are you tracking new plantings within town and including them in your carbon accounting as a sequestration strategy?
So right now we are in our greenhouse, in our inventory, our baseline inventory, and when we've done updates, we are just tracking scope 1 and scope 2. But as part of this project, we are looking at tracking methane and another pollutant. So stay tuned on that. And we're in the really early stages of this project. So we have not come up with a system for tracking new planting, but we are going to complete our baseline inventory, begin to engage citizens as scientists, and stay in touch and track us, and we will let you know the system we put in place and how we're doing.
Let me just say, off the record, on the record, since I ran the Million Trees program. You want to know some of the way that we tracked the volunteer trees, we can sit down and talk about that. So I want to give the last word to Amanda, who's the CEO of Planet Wild, but not without saying thank you so much to everybody on the panel. It was very generous of you to give your time and your expertise. And you will probably get some more questions in the package that we send to everybody. So thank you again, and turn it over to Amanda.
I'm just going to say thank you and happy Earth Day, everyone. It's beautiful out. It's spring here in Westchester, and to just go out in your yard, plant a tree, start small, and just enjoy all that nature has to offer.
That's an excellent end note. Thank you, everybody, for joining, and we will see you in the field soon, we hope.
Thank you, Amanda. Thank you, Bram.
Thank you,
guys.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone.